Hello? Yeah. Hello. So welcome to the last meetup of this year. And then we start anew in 2024. So meetup 127. Let's have a quick look at the schedule. So today, the guest of honor will be a Latvian pixel artist, if I'm right. Right? No? Game designer. Oh, I'm so sorry. Aleksandrs Priedītis will be speaking today. Then we're giving you guys a break, and after that, we have another speaker. Jāzeps Rutkis will tell us what's happening in Latvian game dev industry, because we finally did the infographics. Yay. Then we have some news. Mostly I'm going to talk about funding, because, you know, the year is starting. There's chance to get money. Then it's show and tell, free mic for you guys. After that, I've made a very tiny change in the schedule. If you look at the online, what we have provided and what I have done here. So it's, you know, it's the December meetup, and I did it last year. So I'm going to do it again. It's the end of the year thank you. And then we're closing off with the game, if Elvis comes on time. So let's not tarry anymore, and let's welcome our guest of honor.
Thank you, yes. Okay, good evening, everybody. I would like to start with a simple observation I have about this community, if you'll forgive me. I've seen a lot of these talks be about the financial or production side of game development, and I've seen a lot of conversations around here about the technical side of it, programming and so on. I haven't heard a lot of people talk about game design. This is not particularly surprising. It's kind of to be expected that there's a lot of generalists here who come from a background of programming, let's say, and have picked up game design as kind of a necessity. I'm not like the other girls. I'm a pure game designer. And I feel like it's risky to undervalue the importance of game design in the game development process, though I have to say that I'm very biased in this regard. This talk is an opportunity for me to not just talk about the process of designing stories from the Outbreak, but also focus on some of the methods and techniques that were used in creating this game, a little bit of theory of game design. As a result, some of this might be a little confusing, might be a little complicated. It's definitely easier to understand if you've done game design before or if you played stories from the Outbreak. If some of this feels a little bit complicated, then don't worry about it. If you at least learn one interesting thing this evening that helps you understand game design or game analysis better, then this is a successful evening. Obviously, the focus is going to be stories from the Outbreak. That's going to be the lens through which I explore these game design topics. I considered calling this presentation Stories from the Outbreak, but I thought that might have been a little bit confusing. So who is Stories from the Outbreak? Stories from the Outbreak is a roguelike RPG game where you lead a team of survivors through zombie-infested Latvia. It's a little bit of Slay the Spire, a little bit Darkest Dungeon, and a whole lot of something new that we're kind of experimenting with. Even though I'm the only person on the stage right now, I have to clarify that I am not the entirety of Coldwild Games. This team was made by a talented team of people. It was produced by Vladimir Slav. The pixel art is done by Ellen Nazarenko and Zan Sturi. programming mostly by Carlos Senko with additions from Ivar Sveze and Vladimir Slav, and music is done by Roman Lamtsev. I'm in the weird corner of doing game design and writing, but obviously credit goes to all these other extremely talented people. From seeing these screenshots, you might feel a little bit skeptical, like, yeah, the zombie setting is a little bit overdone. It can feel like we're beating an undead horse, and there's a little bit of skepticism always about turn-based combat games because nobody has the patience for those usually. But I do think that there is something very unique in this game's appeal that we are kind of bringing to the table. It's not easy to articulate, but it's easier to show with an example. So you're playing the game and you see that you get an item that essentially makes you take less damage from counterattacks and do more damage with counterattacks. And you think, wow, that's cool, I'm going to start using counterattacks more. And you start to investigate what are your options for that, and you notice that a character, Jānis, has an ability that makes him do counterattacks for a while, and you start using that more often. But you also realize that he has another ability that makes all the enemies target him. So if you use these two in combination, he's going to do more counterattacks, and that's going to be more effective. And then you go even further, you notice that another character can make Jānis bleed with inflict bleed, which is damage over time in our game with each of these attacks. And you can keep going like this. You can turn that bleed into poison, which is more devastating. And essentially there are these tiny little bits scattered around the game, these tiny little things that you can use. None of them are particularly special on their own, but if you find these connections, the ways that they can work together, you have essentially created a poison machine that is extremely effective. Veteran players will know that this strategy is actually rather simple, and a lot of the complex strategies are much more interesting. As a result, I would say that this is a game about optimization, but not in like the mathematical numbers heavy way of min-maxing things. Rather, it's a game about creatively finding connections between the different game systems, and that can be very interesting. It's similar to the appeal of Slay the Spire. So how do you create a game like this? How do you design it? I'm going to start with the first thing chronologically, which was combat design. We weren't fully decided on all the other details when we started making the game, but we knew that it has zombies, so there should probably be some fighting with said zombies. It makes sense. To start off, we had to make some decisions about system design. So system design is the first step in game design. It is the sort of broad strokes approach, laying the fundamentals, the systems upon which the rest of the game is built. It is the most important part of game design, but arguably also the hardest. You have to make a lot of tough decisions. And so we're designing turn-based combat. We know that. There's a lot of other games that do this, so we don't have to start from scratch. There's some things we can take from other people's work. So here's an image of some of the early art in the game. Let's pretend that we have a super simple approach to combat. We have some friendly units, we have some enemies. They take turns to do damage. Different abilities do different amounts of damage. So I invite you to think about a question. Is this enough in terms of systems to make a cool game? Like at this point, could you say, all right, that's enough systems, I can start making enemies and abilities and all of that other content? No, of course not. It's like, who cares that the abilities do different amounts of damage? That probably means there's a mathematically correct way to play this game. None of your choices are important. This is a complete waste of time. And it's a little confusing to say that because I didn't actually mention anything about the enemies or the abilities. So how can you be so certain that there's nothing interesting in these systems alone? Well, what the problem is that there is not enough room in these systems to create anything interesting. There is not enough space created by these systems to design interesting content. We call this design space very appropriately. It is the amount of options that a designer has for creating stuff within some framework of mechanics. This is a somewhat useful idea in game design. A lot of the time, if your prototype for a game feels a little bit flat and boring, it might be because there's simply not enough design space created by the basic ideas. So what I want to point attention to is that we can look at the various systems of the game. We don't have time to go through all of them. But there are some that have been created mostly for the sake of expanding the design space, giving the player more things to care about, to keep in mind, and so on. Others serve specific purposes. But what's important here, what I want to demonstrate, is that each of these systems exists for some purpose. I'm pretty sure it was designer Christopher Totten who complained that a lot of amateur designers have a bad habit of designing things almost improvisationally, where you kind of start with the question, wouldn't it be cool if blank? And with that approach, you keep adding more and more stuff to the game. You kind of bloat it with systems. This is a pretty weak approach. The unfortunate problem is that with such an approach, you haven't given enough thought and intent to how these systems create the player's experience. A system needs to not just be some cool creative idea, it needs to serve a specific purpose in the design. Otherwise, you often end up with a bloated game with a bunch of systems that don't particularly matter. An example of a system and how it plays a purpose in our game there is focus. Some of the other systems in our game are a little bit derivative, like we're not the first game to use a health bar, but focus is my baby, it's original. And the basic idea is that units get stronger over time as the combat keeps going. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's the gist of it. So why did I think this was a cool idea? Well, a problem in some of the trashier turn-based games is that you feel like you keep making the same decision over and over again, like you're spamming the same ability and nothing changes. With this simple change that units get stronger, now the situation you're in keeps changing as the combat is going on. The system is evolving, and so you have to evolve your strategy as well. And this is interesting on its own, but there's a couple of other things that it brings to the table. Combat also gets more interesting, more messier as time goes on. There's more different things to keep track of as your strategy gets more complicated, as you build to a more complex setup, and as a result, the combat can evolve into a very interesting direction if it's a long enough combat. And there is also some pleasurable little micro progression in the combat. You feel like you become stronger during the combat, and players like the feeling of becoming stronger. That's just free dopamine. So that's an example of how a system gets made, but as for some more general approaches for designing this kind of stuff, I think a very important thing that every designer has to know is elegance. There's multiple different definitions of elegance out there. I like this one that uses complexity and depth. Complexity is how much mental burden the player needs to understand the mechanics, how difficult it is to understand what's going on in the game. Whereas depth is essentially how much stuff you get out of these mechanics, how much interesting, meaningful choices arise from them. These are very sort of generalist ideas. It's a little more complicated than that. But these are, generally you want less complexity and more depth. It's not that interesting to think about the game's rules, it's just trying to wrap your head around how the game even works in the first place, whereas depth is where all the interesting stuff is. Trying to understand the consequences of those rules is generally what creates interesting gameplay. So by elegance, we essentially mean depth minus complexity. So you have a lot of depth and low complexity, we consider such systems elegant. A lot of old board games that have survived the test of time are particularly elegant. For example, chess is considered to be a very elegant game because the rules are simple, but you get a lot of interesting consequences out of those rules. This is something that I invite you to think about when you're designing systems. Be very critical of your own systems, because when you're designing meaningless systems, when you don't think about their purpose in the overall design and you simply add things for the sake of adding things, if those systems turn out to be mediocre, that doesn't just mean you're missing out on the opportunity of creating good systems or so on. You are actively making the game worse. A mediocre system that doesn't add depth but that adds complexity to the depth is making the experience worse. That's a simplification, but it's a meaningful simplification. It is a reason why I am often very hesitant to add new things to the game unless I'm absolutely certain that they will definitely improve the game. Lastly, one of the things that I want to mention about elegance is that is just to emphasize how useful it is as an idea. I consider it to be one of the most useful ideas. It's definitely one of the ideas that I use the most in kind of everyday design. I think you should develop a general feel for it where you don't even consciously think about elegance. There's something fundamental about this. I haven't fully figured out how to articulate this feeling, but I think there is, it has to do with the curiosity with which we approach game systems and try to explore them, and elegance sort of facilitates that. I have seen a lot of systems and ideas that aren't elegant enough, but I have never seen an idea that is too elegant. Let's look at an example to get a better sense of this. Here are two ideas for a status effect. Either this unit takes plus 25% damage from attacks, a standard status effect you'll see in a lot of turn-based games, or this unit gains 1 bleed whenever hit. So bleed is, as I said, our damage over time system. Which of these do you think is more elegant? You don't have to answer, just have an answer in your head. I am going to say that the bottom one is more elegant. Here I have a graph. First off, if you compare the complexity of these two systems, you will notice that the one that adds extra percentage to your damage is more complex. You might think that they're kind of similar because both of them are easy to understand, but every time you actually use this idea of plus 25% damage to your attacks, you have to do that calculation to understand what's going on. You have to do division by 4. Nobody has time for that. It's a little annoying. Whereas if you have this other one that gives 1 bleed whenever hits, as long as you understand what bleed is, that's fine. You know absolutely everything about how it works. There's no unexpected consequences or whatever. As for depth, the gap is much bigger because plus 25% damage from your attacks, yeah, like cool, a number got bigger, who cares? Whereas if you add 1 bleed whenever the enemy hits, that's exciting because it connects this idea to another system, and maybe if you have some other mechanics that are tied to bleed, you can tie those in. So for example, our game has a lot of items and abilities that play with bleed. So for example, this idea that turns bleed into poison, suddenly with this simple status effect, you have many different ways of using it. It's connected to other systems. It's exciting, it's interesting, it's elegant. Another example, a more practical example of what this looked like in decision making, we had this ability for a character called Dmitri. Sadism. It marks a unit, and whenever you attack the unit, you gain focus. Sure, simple enough. We felt that this had a potential problem. There was one character who attacks very rapidly, and he was just too overpowered with this. It seemed like it should be toned down a little bit. We updated the game, and I decided to change it to the following version of the ability, where the duration is lowered a little bit whenever the effect is activated. That's a bit too complicated. There's 2 lines here. I think a lot of the people in this room are currently looking with squinted eyes trying to figure out what's going on. That's a bad sign. A player shouldn't see the ability and immediately think, nope, I'm not using that. I'm not going to try to figure out what it does. So we changed it back. We just slightly lowered the duration to figure it out. I would say that the gameplay was a little bit better with this middle option, but simply to reduce complexity, we still went with this 3rd version. I would say, has resulted in better game design. Obviously, we make some mistakes. Here is a status effect from our game. That's a lot of reading. That's a lot of trying to figure out what's going on here. We're going to hopefully fix this particular one, but we have instances in our game where we could have made it more elegant and should have made it more elegant. As for the next step after system design, that was a very general, brief overlook of how that's done. But content design is the next step. You have to actually make something out of those systems. You have to design characters, abilities, enemies, or whatever happens in your game. And for this, some of the more basic approaches that I had first off was, again, focusing on elegance, trying not to make these abilities or enemies too complicated in their behavior, but rather exploring the design space, trying to squeeze the most out of those basic ideas so that the player wouldn't have to constantly learn new things, but they could instead work with the things that they already know, with the systems that they're already familiar with. One very important piece of advice is to scrap a lot of your ideas. This is something you'll hear from any creative person. I heard I think it was a creator who is not a game designer but in another creative industry who said that you should scrap at least 1/3 of your ideas in any creative process. And this is fairly reasonable. We try to sometimes aim for more than 1/3. We don't always hit the exact number. You don't need to hit an exact number. But not all of your ideas are going to be good, and you shouldn't be scared to toss them out if they're not good enough. Obviously, not everyone has infinite budget to keep iterating on ideas, but you shouldn't be ashamed to remove something from the game if it's not improving it anyway. It's just adding more noise and clutter to the game. An example is that for every character in the game, there are 5 abilities for each character. So 5 different things that each character can do. When I start making a character, I never design 5 abilities. We always start with 7 to 9 abilities, depending on the character, and then keep the ones that are the most interesting and drop the ones that don't add that much to the game. Another important part of designing content and making sure that it's good is balancing it. I want to briefly look at that as well, because that takes a very large part of our creative process. But I think most of the people in this room have a general sense of what balancing is, right? In multiplayer games, it's making sure that the game is fair, that you know, League of Legends or Overwatch, all the characters are somewhat similar strength and there is no best character or best option or whatever. But in single player games, it's a little bit strange, because what is fair in a single player game? I like to look at balancing as very vaguely just tweaking small things until the game feels right, and that's kind of when it is fair. In our game, it is particularly important. It's a strategy game, so if some things are unbalanced, that creates a lot of problems. First off, you have dominant strategies, in which case there is one strategy that simply always works and is just the thing that the player is always going to choose because it is objectively the best option. We have had a few times when players break our games in unexpected ways, and we have to patch that out. And also, when separate things are underpowered, it also creates a similar problem. Why is this such a serious problem? Because it ruins that fantasy that we have, that appeal of optimizing, of finding these creative solutions when you have this one correct solution instead of finding new ones and experimenting every time. Similarly, when we released the game, we had one character that was too weak, Victoria. Nobody liked using her. She was a little clunky and a little unreliable and just not as effective as some similar characters. This is actively hurting the game in a very strong way, because now you're no longer trying to think creatively about using her well, about integrating her in the overall strategy. You just feel like instead of optimizing the tools that you are given, you have to wait until you encounter the right person, and you have to hope that RNG solves the game for you instead of trying to solve it yourself. As for balancing, a very useful thing to use is incomparables. This is a very general idea of any different stats that aren't mathematically comparable to each other. So think about 2 different abilities. One does 20 damage and another does 40 damage. Those are comparable. You can say that one is better than the other. Now think about 2 abilities where one does some amount of damage and the other protects an ally. You can't compare them directly. You can't compare them mathematically. You can't objectively say that one is better than another. Those are incomparables. Incomparables help achieve the sense that things are in balance because they make the game no longer mathematically solvable. They are kind of a mess to balance, though. It takes a lot of effort to try and figure out if the choices in the game are interesting when you use incomparables, because you can't rely on mathematics to solve balance for you. As for mathematics, I've found that they are not enough for balancing. This is also general advice you'll hear from a lot of game designers. One interesting example is that in a recent update, there was one character, Zigmars, who had an ability that felt a little bit too weak. But I thought that it was, quite powerful. It just didn't feel particularly pleasant to use. So I made the ability twice as strong and twice as slow. That if you're familiar with the systems, that actually made the ability slightly weaker, and yet it felt a lot stronger. it felt like every time you use it, it leaves a larger impact on the game. So overall, the character now feels more pleasant to use, more strong, and it's an interesting solution because it's counterintuitive, but it works. However, mathematics can be quite helpful. I rely on a large Excel spreadsheet where I try to calculate as much as possible within the system of incomparables. I don't use mathematics to decide when the game feels right, but it can help me spot various inconsistencies, various problems that I might have otherwise missed. It's a good assistant for balancing. Not all for content design or combat design is perfect, obviously. And I think it's valid to look at some of the criticisms of this process and some of the problems that we are facing in our game. As for our combat, it kind of relies on different units being in the timeline. It's a major mechanic of the game where instead of like taking turns like in a regular turn-based game, your abilities are on a timeline, and each ability takes a different amount of time, and you have to kind of manage that. I don't think we explored it appropriately. We kind of play around with the idea a little bit, but we don't do that much with it, and it's too late in the process to go back and rework the systems to create more design space here. Another problem is that sometimes the mechanics can be kind of confusing to players. I will sometimes play the game and see some unexpected behavior where I think, oh, it's interesting that the edge case works in this particular way, but I didn't expect that to happen. And that should never be something that a designer says. A designer should always know what happens in the game. It kind of hints that some of the systems, some of the design is a little bit clunky and could use a little bit of work. But again, it's quite far into the development and very difficult to fix things like that. Generally, I feel like it would have been useful if we had more pre-production in the game, if we spent more time planning out the different systems and content before we started aiming for a finished product. And this is a bit of a complicated thing to talk about because I on the one hand, I feel like I should have spent more time planning before I'm adding things, because I often discover new interesting ideas as I'm already far into the development of the game, and it's too late to change things. And yet at the same time, I think if we spent more time in pre-production, the game probably wouldn't exist at all. On the one hand, we were toying with the idea of potentially canceling the game, so if we spent 2 more months working on pre-production, that's a lot of money spent that we potentially couldn't afford. And secondly, 2 years ago, I was a much worse designer than I am now. I have learned a lot from designing this game, and if I had more control over the game's direction 2 years ago, I think it might have been a worse game, actually. So the pre-production thing is rather complicated. Thankfully, in combat design, it's not that big of a problem. Combat design is definitely the smoothest part of our game in terms of gameplay. But you start to see more of these cracks when you look at another thing, progression. So progression was affected very deeply by this changing of direction as we're developing the game, because we actually changed the genre of the game. At first we wanted to make a sort of more traditional RPG inspired by like JRPG design, but partway through developing the game we decided to switch to roguelikes. So if you don't know what a roguelike is, a very simplified explanation is that every time you play the game, it's randomly generated. The progression is random, the items you find are random, the enemies you fight, all of the content is to some degree randomly generated, and you're expected to play the game over and over again, and each time you get a new experience. That's kind of how our game works as well. And I think it was very cool that we switched to this genre. It was partially due to practical budget reasons, but it's also a very exciting genre. I think it's a favorite of mine, so it's been very interesting to explore the design of this genre while making stories from the Outbreak. But this switching of genres is never easy in the development process, especially when it comes as late into the development as it did for us, because not all things translate neatly between different genres. So some of the systems in our game are more easily suited for RPGs, but quite difficult to integrate in a roguelike experience. One example is that every character has this stat block, these various statistics that describe their abilities and so on, that describe various numbers that are used in combat. This is a standard for RPG design. It gives a numeric base to the game, and it is a very simple source of reliable progression. However, in a roguelike, I wouldn't say that it's a bad system, but I definitely don't think that it would have been my first choice to use such a numbers-heavy system in a genre that is much more quick and that doesn't have a lot of time to explore these things appropriately. Perhaps the best place where you can see this problem is in the stat checks. So this is something that a lot of RPG games do, where you have some kind of randomized checks based on your stats, where you either succeed or you lose. Disco Elysium uses this. Sunless Sea uses it. There's a lot of games that use some form of stat checks. And in our game, I feel like, again, they're not necessarily a design mistake, but they are a little more awkward than a lot of the other systems. Because in an RPG, you feel like you have enough time to fully explore your characters, to change their statistics in wild directions, and you really feel like you have this agency over these stat checks. You succeed or you fail, not just because the game is kind of random, but because you had an impact on these stat checks. In our game, there is simply not enough time for each character to develop in interesting directions, so these stat checks start feeling a little bit arbitrary, a little bit more based on randomness than your actions. You never feel like you're intentionally steering these stat checks in specific directions. But as for making a roguelike, I still think it was a great choice for to make one. If you want to make a roguelike, I have two pieces of general advice that might be useful. First piece of advice, don't do it. It's not worth it. The problem with roguelikes is that the minimum viable product here is quite complicated. Roguelikes need a lot of stuff in order to become interesting. In order for that randomization to start creating emergent and interesting scenarios, you simply need a lot of content, and that takes a lot of time and a lot of money, and it's difficult to create one. Second piece of advice is play a game called Enter the Gungeon. I know a lot of people say that Isaac is the best roguelike, but I would say that Isaac is low-key mid. Enter the Gungeon, that's where the good stuff is. Enter the Gungeon does some very clever things in its design, especially in its progression. In roguelikes, progression is a complicated topic because progression is related to randomness. So what does this look like? Well, you find random items, you find random bonuses for your characters, the obstacles you face are also random. So a lot of the time when a player plays a mediocre roguelike and they fail, they're going to think, okay, that was because the RNG sucks and I had an unlucky run. And you never want to give your player that feeling. You don't want the players to feel like luck determines whether or not they succeed or not. It's especially for a game like ours where the player has to strategize heavily, you want to focus on making the player feel like they had a serious impact on their success rather than simply relying on luck. So what we do, what a lot of other roguelikes do as well, we give the player some agency in their progression. Every time you find an item, you actually get a choice. You pick one of these two items like in the picture, and then based on that, you can slowly influence your progression in a specific direction. The player doesn't feel like they got unlucky. They have this sense that they made these choices, and that makes these failures a little less frustrating. Another thing that we're doing is that we're manipulating the RNG behind the scenes constantly. I don't want to elaborate on this too much because this is one of those things where the magic disappears when you know how it works. But if you're interested, read on how Enter the Gungeon does this. We lifted a lot of ideas from that game because it also manipulates this RNG behind the scenes, and it does so in very clever and interesting ways. It's excellent for combining randomness with progression. Another one of those super essential pieces of knowledge that you have to know if you want to be a game designer is the idea of intrinsic and extrinsic rewards. Those who know me personally will attest to the fact that I can't shut up about intrinsic and extrinsic rewards, but that's just because it's such a useful framework for analyzing video games. Intrinsic rewards are rewards that arise within the player. So things like fun, catharsis, various emotions, curiosity. Extrinsic rewards are things that the game kind of artificially gives to the player in order to have them continue playing. So experience points, items, progression, level ups, randomized loot, things like that are in the realm of extrinsic rewards. Generally, I prefer intrinsic rewards because they are based more on things like curiosity, on emotions, values of high art, whereas extrinsic rewards are essentially dopamine generators for the monkey brain. So we focus on intrinsic rewards as well in our game. We are focusing on this quality of curiously exploring these systems. But extrinsic rewards are, for various reasons, required to make longer games. It's very difficult to make a long game that relies only on intrinsic rewards. Usually games that do only intrinsic are short story-based games. We make sure that the player has plenty of satisfying progression in the run and during the battles as well. With the focus system, the player always feels like they're getting stronger, and that just gives them dopamine. It's useful to think about these extrinsic rewards as well. Some of the problems is that progression is simply less elegant than a lot of the other systems in our game. Recently, we added a training system that fixed a lot of problems we had with progression, but it's also a little clunky, a little unsatisfying in that sense. So this is another problem that partially arises out of this lack of proper pre-production. I would like to give the players more agency in making their own builds and more control over what items they get, but this is something we have had to partially give up on because it's simply a very difficult goal to achieve and we haven't had enough time to address it. Multi-tanking, I don't want to spend time explaining what that is, but it's a very annoying strategy that players do that we can't get rid of. And in general, I would say that the game is slightly a bit too ambitious. It's very difficult, again, to create a roguelike, and we do a lot of things, and in the combat design, we have had time to fully explore those things and to create something interesting out of them. But as for the progression, we have spent a bit less time on that, I would say, and it's a little less interesting as a result. Very briefly to hop through narrative design, but that's also the shortest part of the presentation, but the one that I feel is the most interesting one to a local audience. The game is set in Latvia 2020, so the idea of a deadly virus spreading in this country in 2020 should be familiar to the audience. There's a lot of references to Latvian culture, Latvian names, places, politics, cultural concepts, and so on. And we also have some commentary on local politics. It is not necessarily commenting on specific parties or people or so on, but rather exploring the various ways in which Latvians approach politics and think about them. As for the systems that we use to explore these narratives, we have events, which are essentially some text descriptions that you then get various choices in, and you can steer your team in various directions with these choices. You have conversations where the survivors will talk to each other and converse and get to know each other, and the player also has some choices here. And there are sort of longer form stories in the form of character backstories that are unlockable. These are more free form and less directly related to gameplay, but just pieces of writing. This is also a kind of direction in which we're struggling with, partially because I'm not a professional writer and I don't have previous experience in writing, but I'm trying to make do with what I have. This is, I would say, the least methodically designed part of our game. With every idea that I have or that the team has, there's usually a lot of problems involved, and as a result, it's the part of the game that I'm the least confident about. But thankfully, we are slowly moving in a more coherent direction. There's a lot of things in our narrative that are cool ideas, but they're not as interesting to interact with as the various things we have designed for combat and progression. So for the final update that is coming up in a couple of months, we are focusing more on the narrative. We are slightly lowering the initial ambitions of creating a story generator and instead focusing on at least making these systems as interesting as possible within the format. And we will hopefully improve the narrative with this update. The final update of the game is coming in roughly 2 months. It's currently available in early access, and we're hoping to leave early access in February next year. For now, you can already play stories from the Outbreak. It's available on Steam. If you want more of my silly opinions, you can find me on several websites on the internet. Thank you, that is all.
Thank you so much for your talk. Any questions?
Yeah, thank you. It's a very interesting talk. I wanted to ask about incorporating player feedback. So you made use of the early access system, and it sounded to me like you're essentially you're designing a system, and you know, you're trying to make it work. But and you were somewhat against incorporating systems for the sake of incorporating them because they're cool. So I imagine you do get player feedback and saying, wouldn't it be cool if you could do X or Y? So how do you? What is your approach for incorporating the feedback? And a somewhat related question also to early access is how do you know as a designer when the game is done, when you should ship it versus continuously tweaking it and improving it?
Thank you. Those are very interesting questions. The part about player feedback, that one, there's a general piece of advice that all designers say that I strongly agree with and that we also use in our game, which is that a designer should pay very close attention to the problems that players are pointing out, because players are often great at identifying various problems, at various dissatisfactions they have with the game, but a designer should be very careful about listening to the solutions that players are offering to those problems, because players will often have this wouldn't it be cool if approach. We have had people who are proposing things that are very often unrealistic to implement, or they don't fit in well with the other systems, or it's expected because your players aren't game designers. But still, these systems are so vast and broad that it's very difficult for me to single-handedly spot all the problems and figure out all the neat things that you can do with the game. So it is very useful to have a player audience, especially for balancing. I have used player feedback extensively to spot various places of imbalance in these systems, and then I figure out how to fix these problems. As for figuring out when the game is finished, that's not my job. That's what our producer Vladimir does. You're never gonna feel like the game is finished, but thankfully we have Vladimir, who has at least given us some time frame, and we have pushed that time frame back several times, but you have to give yourself a deadline eventually, otherwise the project is never going to be finished. It helps that we have a lot of other people's money, people who have bought this game, and we are kind of pressured to finish it and not leave it in early access hell.
Alex, great talk. It's amazing to see more people who are also like seeing game design as a very important part. I'm a game designer by education myself, and I'm really curious about what you mentioned earlier, how you wanted to make this an RPG, but end up making it a roguelike because of the financial constraints. If those constraints, for one or the other reason, were gone, say this game performs much better than you expect, and you have nearly limitless funds, would you consider making an RPG with a similar style?
Very interesting question. I don't think so, actually. I kind of grew to enjoy the roguelike format. I've always been a huge fan of roguelikes more than I've been of RPGs. It was very difficult at first to kind of see how this transition could happen, to see how we could coherently transition to the roguelike format, but I'm very glad that we did it. It was a great decision from the team, and I'm happy that we have established ourselves into this weird little corner in which we have found ourselves.
Oh well, okay. This is actually my probably first like game dev association kind of a meetup, and this is my first kind of lecture, and this was honestly a really good lecture, like a very good first impression. And I really appreciate how you defined and quantified a lot of kind of, you know, these kind of aspects of design and such thinking. And my specific question is also about how you quantified the idea of elegance, of depth and complexity. You made a distinction between them, which I liked. I get it. Though, wouldn't you say that depth contributes to complexity? If a game is more, more deep, more depth, the decisions you make has more impact, as in like affects more layers of thinking. As in chess, it's as you said, kind of simple rule set where now, but it's very deep. But in a sense, now every decision is very complex. This is the kind of where I wanted to ask, what is kind of, doesn't depth contribute to complexity? And the other one is you gave an example of a very elegant game, simple but has great depth. What is the opposite? A extremely complicated game that has no depth.
I will start by answering your second question because that one's a lot easier. There are very few games that I have played which I would say have a lot of complexity but not a lot of depth, because usually those games don't get recognized enough for me to even notice them. I've heard that this is a problem that trashy strategy games have. I haven't played a lot of strategy games in general, so I can't say I have seen a lot of particularly bad examples. But if you feel like the rules of a game are very difficult to understand and there's not a lot of interesting stuff arising from these rules, that would probably be the case. As for your first question, does depth contribute to complexity? One thing you have to keep in mind is that these frameworks are intentionally very vague and non-specific. Probably you could argue that under some definitions depth does contribute to complexity. I like to think of them as kind of separate things, though. I use the words mechanics literacy and dynamics literacy. So mechanics literacy is when you understand the rules of the game, you understand the basic fundamental mechanics of the game. And dynamics literacy is when you understand what arises from these rules, how those rules behave in practice. And I feel like that's something that perhaps happens with chess. It's very easy to gain a mechanics literacy. You just spend 15 minutes learning the basic rules. But acquiring a dynamics literacy in chess, well, it's something that people spend their whole lives on and never fully grasp. So I would make a very generalist, but still I think a very true claim that finding this dynamics literacy is always much more interesting than earning this mechanics literacy. And that's how I sort of separate the two. But obviously they are deeply intertwined concepts. You need some complexity in order to achieve depth. You need to put some information into your game, and whether or not the relationship works in the other way around, well, you could argue that yes, sometimes.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I wanted to ask about gameplay loop, right? So you mentioned combat design and you mentioned your progression design, but in the end, what player will be spending their time in the game is the overall gameplay loop. So specifically the question is, have you or your team used any kind of templates or pre-existing ideas when approaching the design of the gameplay loop itself?
Very interesting question. We have had a, I would say, not particularly methodical approach to identifying a specific gameplay loop and aiming for that. We have definitely indirectly been inspired by other games. We have simply observed what gameplay patterns we enjoy and kind of taking ideas and tidbits from other games and finding what works and what doesn't work in our game, and that is itself indirectly designing the gameplay loop. I would say that I don't know if this is a weak point for me, but or rather some kind of particularity of me in design, but I don't usually think too much about the gameplay loop, as I don't try to identify a specific gameplay loops. I feel like it is a piece of theory that is very useful in game design, but it's very interesting to understand it, and it's crucial to understand it, but it's not one that is particularly actionable. I don't feel like it's easy to use that knowledge of specific gameplay loops to make your game better. I have a more vibe-based approach, essentially. I hope that answers your question.
Any more?
Right then, question about difficulty, or rather the idea of difficulty. Should the game become more easy as you're progressing, or harder, basically? Or should it maintain basic similar difficulty as you progress regardless? So as you're unlocking essentially more gear, abilities, and so on and so forth, basically, should the game become easier as you're progressing, or become harder because, hey, you're progressing and the difficulty is increasing as you're going through more difficult enemies, I suppose. So yeah, basically the question is, should...
Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, he has a theory on this particular topic where he essentially states that difficulty, the overall sense of it, stays relatively the same throughout the game. The player becomes more capable, the player becomes more skilled as the difficulty of the game increases, as the sort of as you find stronger challenges, more complicated ones, the player also becomes smarter, and the overall ratio of game challenge to player skill ideally remains somewhat unchanging. Otherwise, the game can become either too frustrating or too simplistic. I would say that overall, if you're aiming for a sort of quantifiable difficulty, it's better to slowly increase it. Though in our game, it's also quite complicated because there's a lot of feedback loops. These items can sometimes create very complicated combinations that make the end game sometimes very easy, actually. And we're kind of fine with this. Sometimes a roguelike will become very easy if you're just lucky with finding particular items. In general, though, the approach is to make challenges more more challenging as the game progresses. It's very difficult to talk about this because usually when people use the word difficulty, they think about a kind of quantifiable quality that the game has, when actually it's a characteristic that explains the player's experience. So it's very subjective, very dependent on the player. So if you're thinking about challenges in the game should become more challenging, but the player should have a somewhat stable sense of difficulty.
Right. You will be here the entire evening, right? So any more questions, you can ask him right away. And a round of applause for our guest of honor. Thank you so much for talking. So guys, you probably need a break now, right? Okay, yeah. So it was intended till 8. Obviously, we're late for our break. So it's going to be till 8:15. Get your drinks, breathe some air. And then return for Jāzeps, because he will be speaking. Okay, guys, let's take our seats, let's calm down, and let's have on the stage Jāzeps Rutkis. Where is he? Ah, okay. I was like, where did he go? Yeah, you can clap.
All right, yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm Jāzeps Rutkis, and and I'm going to present the industry data that we have gathered. Right. So first of all, a couple of things about. We lost it. Anyways, so a couple of things about the limitations and. Thank you. Right. So first of all. We're presenting the data that we gathered for 2021 and 2022. And as you can see, we're doing it in December because we're using primarily Lursoft and self-reporting forms. And cool. Anyways, carrying on with what I wanted to say here. So companies, they have until I think June to report their earnings. So we can only start gathering data then. Then we send out the self-reporting forms, so it takes time for those to come back. It takes time for us to compile the data and for us to create the visualizations. But here we are. So first of all, here is the industry turnover and profit. As you can see, the also bonus points if you can spot the mistake. But as you can see, the turnover has actually continued steadily increasing, up to essentially 26 million, whereas the profits have gone down somewhat. So there could be a lot of different causes for it. The more optimistic one is that companies are investing. Perhaps they didn't have releases because, of course, that also heavily defines how how the profit is going to look. Elvis? Thank you. That's the mistake. I wish I could give you a beer, but that's the thing there. Yes. So obviously, it would be very surprising if we consistently manage to have higher profit than turnover. Not an economist, but I don't think that's possible. So obviously, the colors are swapped there. Apologies for that. Anyways, next slide. So here we can see the platforms that people were developing games for in 2022. So this was the first year that we were doing the forms. That's why we're not going to have historical data from here on out, just a little bit of maybe anecdotal evidence. As you can see here, primarily people are developing for mobile and PC. Previously, we saw that previously it seemed that there were more games developed for mobile. The other thing that is, of course, difficult to ascertain from this data is how large are the teams. Because we could have some really large projects on mobile, for example, while a lot of smaller projects on PC. In terms of company sizes, this we get from Lursoft, so that means we have pretty good coverage. And as you can see, a lot of companies actually employ solo creators, and we have relatively few large studios, and for our definition, large is 25 plus, which globally speaking is actually a very small number. But yeah, that was the cutoff that we used. Yeah, there's a question? I don't know that I have that on hand. I know we call some companies out in the next slide. Yeah. Anastoti. Yeah, I'm pretty sure, but I don't have that on hand. Cool, right? So here again, we sent out the forms, and the data for the gender breakdown is extrapolated based from the data that we have. But as you can see, it is primarily male, so around an 80-20 split. We also had an individual reporting as other. So yeah, that's also represented in the data. And in terms of profits, here you can see that some companies are profitable, some aren't, but very few companies have significant profits. So here, in terms of top grossing companies, rather than the ones with the most profit, we have Fun Generation Lab, Brain Games, Hypercell, and Astoti. I would be very surprised to see at least one of these companies in 2023 But as I said, this is the data for 2022. All right, and yeah, that's the data. Are there any other questions? Thank you. Okay, we're also gonna publish this data on our channels, right? Yeah. Oh, I heard in the last one that math is important, but not everything, so. All right, anything else? Okay, then thank you, and I'll hand it back to Laura.
Right, so next up we have the news. So still, I'm looking for speakers for this amazing event. So if you feel like applying, there's a QR code. It's immensely appreciated. So next up, for Latvian Game Developers Association members only, you have a chance to get 20% off to your trip to Talent Startup Days. If you're curious about that, just ask. Next up, for members again only, so this is this one magical time of the year where we all come together and we figure out the budget and who's gonna keep leading this association. So please don't be late, because otherwise we have to do it again. This time the members, how do you say it in English, kopsapulce? It's not a board meeting. Board is just the board. We need all the people. Association members meeting, yeah, something like that. So it's gonna happen here, and on the, where did I put the date? On the 3rd of January, members only. Because we had it on the 5th, and then there were objections that it's Friday, so now it's the 3rd. Okay, every time. Then, you know, snap out of the party. Come here, get some drinks, do some voting, go back to party. All right, next up, let's talk about funding. First off, immersive content development. This is Creative Europe funding. So there's a lot of stuff there. I'm gonna put it out in our Discord server as well, so you can read it. But basically, you can Google Media Call Immersive Content Development. This is for games, specifically for story-driven games and you can see the numbers here, pre-financing rate, maximum grant size up to 200,000 euros. It's a lot of paperwork, but if you need money and you're willing to do the paperwork, why not? So this is a similar, same program. This is for innovative tools and business models. So not for the game itself that you're making, but maybe you're doing a Unity extension to port or compress textures better. So this could be something, or maybe you're thinking about how to optimize your business processes. So this is something. Yeah, and there's a third one. I took it out, but if you're doing events, so the same program, Creative Europe, you can look it up, and maybe you need it. The next thing, Global Game Jam, guys. It's January. It's the end of January, and we are hoping to see everyone and everybody there, because it's totally for free. It's in University of Economics and Culture, so rather close by, and everyone is welcome. Doesn't matter if you're a seasoned veteran. We don't have a lot of those in Latvia, but there are some who always come. And for beginners, so it doesn't matter you're studying or you have never made games, you are welcome in this event. So you can actually, the jam site is already open, so you can register for the jam. Registering will be needed when you want to submit your game, also for the statistics, so we appreciate that. You can use the QR code and register right away. So there's such a thing as Nordics Nordics. I forgot the full name, but it's basically Nordics cultural funding. So this is when you are doing anything that involves working together with Nordic countries or other Baltic countries, and you're looking for funding. They have a lot of different types of funding that constantly get opened. So one of them is open the 2nd of January. And this is mobility funding. So this is not for developing your game, but this is if you want to go to conferences, if you want to stay in artist residency. So these are artist co-working spaces. There are some example uses. Collaboration with colleagues in another Nordic or Baltic country. So maybe you have some freelancers, you need to go over to visit them. Guest play, that's more for a theater, but an exhibition, you want to go to an exhibition or event or a conference in one of those countries. Participation in conference, meetings or workshops, and also research when you want to collaborate with the other countries. So it has to be a collaboration project. And the countries involved are Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Faroe Islands, Greenland, Iceland, Latvia, Lithuania, Norway, Sweden, and how do you pronounce it? Åland? Okay. So this is something, again, quite a lot of paperwork, but it is a grant. It's not a loan, it is a grant. So maybe if you're looking to get knowledge or network with the Nordic countries, this could be something for you. Nope. Too far. Latvian Game Awards, March 2024. We are proud to announce that finally, after many years of trying, the main award, Game of the Year, will be awarded by the Minister of Culture of the Republic of Latvia. So she will be there on site giving the award to the best of the best of the best of you. So again, the event, free for all, everybody is welcome, and I really hope to see all of you there. It's probably going to be in University, Latvijas Universitāt, Latvian University rooms, the same place as last year. I talked about Nordic Culture Point grants, and also, we still don't know the dates yet, but for the first time ever, so there used to be this incubator by Latvian Investment Agency. It was for creative arts and culture. And the games, of course, were never really mentioned there. If you're creative, you can apply. But up till now, it was never mentioned. And for the first time ever, they're opening the new program next year. And games are in the main list that can receive the support. So they have 3 programs, idea creation. There's no money there, but there's some mentoring and some help for traveling. Pre-incubation, again, no money for your development, sorry, but mentoring and traveling, and also office spaces for free in all of the biggest Latvian cities. And then incubation, probably the one that most of you are kind of most interested, that's where the money is. That's where you can pay for something to be developed, and then they will return a percentage of your expenses back. So just something to keep your eyes and ears open. I think that's it for the news. And let's go through this. Let's make some changes to the usual program. Give me a moment. Okay, let's do it. So, the end of the year, the magical season of giving and saying thank you. So the first thing is, thank you guys. Because if you wouldn't come here, there would be no GameDev Meetup. We're doing this for you, and we're so happy that you come here, you ask questions, you participate, and you just make this place a very nice and have a really good vibe. So a round of applause to yourself, I guess. Yeah, you can pat on the back, exactly. The second thing is, of course, the main, I don't know, it sounds sinister to say it, but like the main attraction of the meetup is the speaker. And here's the list of all the amazing humans that found the time throughout the year to come here. Remember, this is not like a paid thing. Everyone here comes and volunteers. And these are the amazing people from Latvia, from Finland, from Germany, even from Japan, who came here and who spoke in this meetup in this place. So wherever you are right now, we have one person here, but a round of applause to all those amazing people. Oh, the last thing is the people who make it happen. It's not a hard work, but it's a work that needs to be done consistently all the time, and through that, it kind of becomes hard. So let's go in no particular order. First off, Jāzeps. Jāzeps Rutkis. Yep. So he helped me find speakers, because what we try to do is every time there's a speaker, we try to have someone new. And obviously, Latvia isn't like the biggest country with the biggest games industry in the world. So it's becoming harder and harder every time we do it. So Jāzeps has been a big help in the matter. So next up is the guy without whom there would be no stream. So Simons Mikos. If it wasn't for, when I was applying to organize this meetup, I said either someone takes the organization of the stream, or there will be no stream. And Siemens saved us. So, and next one, Jan Skuy, sadly he couldn't come. But if he wouldn't do his work, you would have no idea this meetup is happening. Like, I would be here alone just talking to myself. He does all the social media, all the events, all the Kurpes and Live Riga and Eventbrite and everything else. So shout out to you, wherever you are. Maybe you're watching the stream. I don't know. Can we have a round of applause for him? Maybe he can hear us. And then another person. I don't really see him here right now. I saw him before. Oh, he's hiding. So without him, there is no game. There is no game. He's just tapping on his phone, just awkwardly. Come here. Round of applause. Elvis Krasniņš. No, go back. Stop spoiling things. Anyway, what I was giving out is something I do on my free time on the side, which is beekeeping and honey collection. I don't know, maybe you can call it like that. Well, it's more like on the side, because my side is Latvian GameDev Association. And me, I'm the main organizer of this event, so more honey for me. There's a dog for scale. Thank you. And with that, my part is over, and it's time for the game. The game.
Yo, oh. Hi. It'll be alright. Welcome to the Oh, maybe I should plug it actually in. Okay, this never happened. Let's try again. Welcome to the Game. To make it more epic, I added some white gangster. So the rules are always simple. I will show you some pictures, you try to guess the game, and you get a beer. So let's start with the first one. 3, 2, 1. 3, 2, 1. No. 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 Oh, this is harder than I thought. Yes, Overwatch. You get the beer. So yes, it's Overwatch 2 coming out this year. Or is it already out? I don't know. Is it? Okay. So the next one will be a hard one. I wish you luck. 3, 2, 1. Yes, siphon filter. You got it. I actually didn't expect it to be that fast. Here you go. Yes. This is a siphon and this is a filter. And the last one of the so a new game, an old game, and now one from previous meetups. So 3, 2, 1. Yes, Unreal Tournament. You got it. So you get a beer. So that's it from me, and like and subscribe our social networks so that Ministry of Culture and others see us and give us something. So see you next time. Bye.
I just realized I skipped show and tell. So, okay. So, yeah, if you still have games you want to maybe playtest, you can put them out like Siemens have done it. If not, then talk to people, get some drinks, chill out, and enjoy the rest of your evening.